Mandisa Vundla is a South African poet known as the first two-time undefeated World N Sound Slam champion. Vundla is an educator, a slam coach, co-editor of Home is Where the Mic Is, and the founder of the Poetry Zone ZA, a poetry development agency focused on advancing poetry culture and its trade in South Africa. So having worked in the industry for over a decade, Vundla utilises her expertise to take young emerging poets under her wing through the Brave Spoken Youth Poetry Mentorship Project. Mandisa Vundla is in studio to join us now. So good to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So you need to start explaining a few things to me, because this is a new world to me. Now I'm reading you as the first two-time undefeated
Word and Sound
Slam champion.
Yeah.
What is that?
It's actually the first platform that popularized slam poetry culture.
Okay.
And slam poetry culture is competitive poetry, right? So in South Africa, there was a time when poetry really went dead, when it was really quiet, and a few poetry houses were producing poetry shows. And then Word and Sound was running just an open mic, and one day they were like, actually, let's just turn it into a competition, you know? And that's basically the gist of what slam poetry is. I mean, we see the Americans do it, and we see how big it is internationally, but it's kind of like exporting that into South Africa. So we used to compete every single month, like literally every single, it's a league, it's a poetry league actually, you know?
Okay.
So every single month you would prepare your poem and then you would perform. So at that time, the first year I couldn't get in. I struggled a lot to get into the top 10. And then afterwards, I was just like winning it, man. I was on it. I was on the mark. And so I was the first two-time, because I had to come back to defend my title. Yeah, so I won it the first time around. And then I was like, okay, I've been slamming for a very long time. Thanks. What else can poetry do for me? And then they put so much pressure. I think I succumbed to the pressure. They're like, you have to come and defend your title. What do you mean? And then afterwards, I went and I defended my title, and I am the first two-time undefeated.
This is incredible. You need a belt or something. I don't know what you need, but you need all the bells and whistles for this, because this is fantastic. And as I'm understanding it, I mean, it's not easy to do. I mean, you're going up there, you're competing with the best of the best. You started when poetry was literally just the spoken word. Now there is so much more to it.
Definitely.
The music, the theatre and the drama and the whole issues that come with it. You have moved so much with this time. How has it changed since you've been a part of this industry?
I mean, poets are doing more than just poetry. I think we are thinking about the economics of poetry, you know, like what does the word economy sector look like? If I'm a poet, am I just performing as a poet, or am I also writing, or am I also producing, you know? Because at that time, I think when you're at the forefront of the industry as it's regrowing and rebuilding, you know, you're also thinking ahead to say, okay, after this, what do I do next? And I could have published a book, but I was like, I think all those poems, most of them must just stay in history. You know, I can archive them there. I'm not ready to really put together a body of work, but there were poems that stayed with me. And those are the poems that I wanted to archive professionally, properly, put it in an album. And so then I released a poetry album. But at this point in time, poets are using poetry and film. There's poetry film, there's theatricals, you know, we call it a poetical. There's poetry albums. Poets are actually releasing music, you know, poetry albums, spoken word poetry albums. So we're kind of playing around with the spectrum, and we're not sticking to the fact that I have to just be confined to a mic and that's the story of my life. I think we are diversifying.
Amazing. And I mean, I love the idea of putting out a poetry album, a spoken word tribute album. And the one that I'm referring to is this one that you dedicated to Miriam Makeba. I mean, why Miriam Makeba? I mean, I obviously know the answer because I know how great this woman was and what she did and what she stood for. But that's in my eyes. In your eyes, it's completely different. So perhaps you want to tell us why.
Yeah, I mean, when I started poetry, you know, in as much as it wasn't as serious, it was like, I'm a poet. You know, when you don't see a lot happening out there in poetry, you don't think it's serious. You don't think it's a serious art form or practice, you know. And at that time, I was performing the poems. And people were starting to note the poems. And they were becoming very serious. And I think I was, at that point in time, frightened. Because when you're writing in what you imagine as a small, personal and private voice. And it just so happens that you're a poet and you're going to stand on a stage and perform all of that in front of people. But you don't expect people to resonate. You don't expect people to say, hey, I like you. I like what you said.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. And so I was being called an activist. I was being called a feminist. And I was frightened, I don't want to lie.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you.
I was a baby and I was frightened because I was just like, ooh, the academics are doing that thing where they are kind of defining what they're hearing, you know? And I had to figure out who I actually really am, and that was the transition point. What stories do I want to tell? Who do I want to write about? Who am I writing about? So you kind of step out of the art and you kind of actually have to now look at yourself to say, what exactly am I doing and who am I doing it for? And is this an extension of who I really am? And at that time, people were like, oh, but you're so controversial, you're so political. And I'm like, guys, I just write poetry, I promise you. I have no intention of stirring. And I listened to a Miriam Makeba interview back then. And I mean, her work has been classified as political for a very long time. And she responded so beautifully. She said, you know, she doesn't write about politics. She writes about the stories of her people. So it's also a personal story.
Absolutely.
She's writing in a very personal voice. I think that was a monumental just like period for me. And I kept just finding her voice. I was like, I need to listen to this woman more often so I can place and locate myself in this craft and in the work that I'm doing. And it gets very difficult, especially with poetry, because it's on the outskirts of the cultural sector. But you got to keep your thing. You got to keep doing what you're doing.
You really do, and you have to you've got to find the meaning and make a difference. And I'll just relay a very quick story to you about my memory of Miriam Makeba. I remember it was many, many years ago. Obviously, I mean, she's been gone now for 14 years. And we were sitting in an event, and she was performing at this event. And they had seated her at the front table with all the other VIPs. And she refused to sit there. And the organizers were all up in arms. It's like, but why? Why don't you want to sit with us? And she's like, if my band are not good enough to sit in this room with me and eat this food and be at this function, and you put them in a tent outside, then I'm not good enough to be here. And boy, did you see people scuttle to bring the band in and make them part of it. And do you know what I'm saying? Not controversial. It's real. You know,
it's a real life story.
Exactly. And you're resonating with that. I mean, that's just a memory you've spurred in me.
A lot.
I
but also her
it.
humanity, her stance, her standpoint.
It was amazing. But let's talk you now, because as amazing as she is, you've also got a massive voice that you are now using. And you say people thought it was very controversial, but what is that key message? I mean, I'm reading about what other people feel your key message is about, but from your mouth, what are you trying to convey in your poetry?
I think for me, I don't even write from a place where I'm writing for people, you know? I think when I write, I am at that point in time trying to unpack what I'm going through, you know, like creating a sense of, it's a mirror for me in my life as a black woman living in South Africa, looking at writing against my own impediments, you know, looking at writing my way forward. I think for me, my goal is constantly writing my way forward. And poems like, I mean, the album has poems like Dear Daki, which is the one I'm going to be performing. And Dear Daki really, really speaks about encouraging the black person to keep going. Like our hunger breeds genius, like, you know. And at that time, I was really working on myself and my company, and things were hard. And I was like, no one is coming to feed you with their hunger. And so I thought, I'm going to need to pause and figure out if I need to cry first or if I'm going to cry and then write and then go back and continue. So I kind of write things out of the way.
Beautiful. I can't wait to hear this, because we heard you fall into a zone as you were rehearsing. The cameras were off. We were saying that you finished, but you never finished. And you didn't hear that. I love that. Before I wrap, because I need to wrap, this photo. What's happening here? The old meets the new. What is going on in this photo? I love it.
It's a love song for Miriam, and whilst I was deciding on which poems are going to go into this album, right? I had a poem, completely unrelated at a different period, called Fokoko Esdambahlang. And at some point when I was releasing this work, I was like, is this for Miriam? But you have a Fokoko Esther? Like, you need to figure out what you're saying with this album. And I did some deep thinking, and I realized their stories are so similar. It's almost one and the same not person, but experiences. They never finished school. Miriam never finished school. Esther never went to school. They literally have taken cultural heritage and commercialized it, and that has become their career. And so I always said, guys, I think if apartheid didn't happen, we would have been fine, you know? And so there's a poem there for Gogo Esther Mahlangu.
Love it.
And this picture is like half wisdom, half youth, half wisdom.
Well, she just got another honorary doctorate this week, so for her genius and a great tribute. It really is. So nice to have you in the studio and just chatting to you. I'd love to just go and have a coffee with you, never mind sit here and just get to know more about her. But you're going to hear more about her as she speaks out for us. Nearly said played out, but speaks out for us. Poet and Sound Slam champion Mandisa Vundla talking all things poetry. She'll be back after the break for a performance.